Assalamualaikum, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to MAS-ICNA for putting on this incredible and important conference, and to the few of you who are joining us today. I know there are a lot of things on the program, so it's always hard to pick what session to go to, so I appreciate you joining us today. Inshallah, I'll be speaking alongside Sister Aisha Al-Adawiya. Hopefully she'll be joining us shortly, and I'm really honored to be speaking with her today. My name is Sarrah Buageila, and I'm the project manager at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. That's a nonprofit applied research think tank that does, that conducts objective solution-seeking research that empowers the American Muslim community. So I want to start off today by asking each of you to think of the last Muslim character you saw on TV. What were they doing? Were they inventing a new surgical technique that saves lives and money? Were they conducting soil tests to make sure entire communities are safe? No, probably more than likely what you saw was a brown, foreign, scary-looking character up to no good, either committing a violent act or scheming about his next plot. And this is not something we just know anecdotally in terms of media coverage of Muslims and something we might be blowing out of proportion, but actually a lot of research has been done on the media coverage of Muslims. According to one organization called Media Tenor, they analyzed 2.6 million Western news stories about Muslims and Islam, and what they found were that 9 out of 10 stories of Muslim life were related to violence. That's 9 out of 10 stories. So almost exclusively, the coverage of Islam and Muslims in the media is negative or related to violence, which is mostly negative. In fact, another study conducted by 416 Labs showed that over the last 25 years, the New York Times portrayed Islam more negatively than cancer and cocaine. So you can see that this problem of media coverage and perceptions of Muslims is not something, again, that we're anecdotally feeling when we turn on the news. Research actually shows just how bad it is. Now, this is a problem in and of itself, but when you pair the negative media with religious illiteracy, it's a recipe for disaster. And religious illiteracy just means a lack of understanding of the religion. Scholars of religion argue that discrimination and stigmatization are often fueled by religious illiteracy. So basically, the less you know about someone, particularly a religious group, the more likely you are to hold prejudice about that group or to believe the stereotypes about that group. And the opposite is true. The more you know about a religion and group, the less likely you are to hold prejudice about that group. So unfortunately, in America, what we find is that we have vast religious illiteracy when it comes to Islam and Muslims. According to Pew, 55% of Americans say they do not know very much or they know nothing at all about Islam and Muslims. Also, fewer than half of Americans say they know a Muslim personally. This means that the majority of Americans in this country are introduced to Islam and Muslims via the media, which we just established is overwhelmingly negative. These negative and limiting media representations leave us constantly working in a reactive and defensive state. We are always focused on denouncing false claims and leaving little time or energy to objectively study or talk about who we are, our lived experiences, and how we contribute to this country. So that's where the Muslims for American Progress or project study comes in. The MAP project is a public education project that serves as an intervention to the current negative loop we find ourselves in. So what we did was we quantified the contributions that American Muslims make in the state of Michigan in 8 categories: civics and democracy, economic development, medicine, STEM, philanthropy and nonprofits, arts and entertainment, sports, and education. We paired the hard numbers that we collected with profiles of individuals working in these 8 categories. And we topped our project off with a photo narrative collection that features beautiful portraits and short personal narratives that showcase our diversity, our humanity, and virtually introduces people to our community. I want to pause here and note that this is not a propaganda project. It is not an appeal to convince our fellow citizens or the government to like us or accept us based on our merit and contributions. As humans, as Americans, we have every right to be here in this country, and we have every right to stand up and demand those rights, whether we are the wealthy philanthropist or the one in need. But what this project does is give Muslims the opportunity to tell part of our story through data. Now, when you study the Muslim community here in America, it's tricky because you can't just comb through census records to find data on our population, what jobs we do, where we live, because if you've ever filled out the census, you actually there isn't a place to denote what religion you are. It's actually illegal to ask about religion through census records. So what we did was we took a mixed method approach when we were doing our research. We conducted over 150 lengthy qualitative interviews, and we did data analysis on state licensing records and organizational records. What we found was a community that is tiny in size, but making huge impact. So before diving into the impact that we're making, I wanted to set the stage with some basic demographics of our community. Like I said, it's hard to find demographic information on our community, and so when we have it, I like to share it. The majority of the numbers that I'll be sharing today come from ISPU's annual poll that we conduct every year in January. However, the first one I'm going to share is from Pew. So according to Pew's most recent 2017 numbers, there are approximately 3.45 billion Muslims in America, making up just 1.1% of the population. In our MAP research, we found that there are approximately 274,000 Muslims in Michigan, making up 2.75% of the population. So again, a really small community, just over 1% nationally, and in the state of Michigan, where we conducted our research, just under 3%. Muslims are incredibly diverse and are actually the only faith community in this country that do not have a majority race. African Americans make up the largest segment of Muslims at 25%. 24% of American Muslims are white, 18% are Asian, 18% are Arab, 7 are mixed, and 5 are Hispanic. While Muslims have been in this country through its inception via enslaved Africans, today the community is almost evenly split between foreign-born and native-born Muslims. Muslims are also the youngest faith community in this country. Approximately 80% of Muslims are under the age of 50 years old. 80%. This number really stuck out to me because if you're in any Muslim setting, whether it be a conference, a training program, a khutbah, you always hear, what about the youth? What are we doing for the youth? Which makes sense because there are a lot of us in that demographic. And this next stat is surprising to a lot of people, but Muslims span the entirety of the socioeconomic spectrum. A full 35%, so just over 1/3 of our community, lives at or below the poverty line. And this is, like I said, often really surprising to Muslims. Obviously not all, because if you're one of the 35% of Muslims who live at or below the poverty line, that's not surprising. But sometimes there's a stereotype of the community of being very wealthy. They're all working professionals, all doctors and engineers. And while we definitely have people in the middle and upper class, we have a significant part of our community that is living at or below the poverty line. So starting with demographic data in our community, we're already painting a very different portrait of who Americans are compared to who gets airtime on TV. Again, if you were just going off TV standards, all Muslims are brown, scary, foreign, hairy, other, it's just not representative of who we are. So moving on to the MAP findings themselves. One of the most challenging things about the MAP project that I find is to figure out what to share in a 20-minute presentation. We did a lot of research, talked to a lot of really interesting people, and it's so hard to narrow it down in a presentation. So I'll try not to inundate you with information, but also tell a great story about our community. So today I'll be sharing findings from 4 of the 8 categories we studied and introduce you to some of the 150 people that we interviewed. And I'm gonna start with the philanthropy and nonprofit category. I know we have a small group here, but by a show of hands, how many people in this room either work for, volunteer for, or have donated to a nonprofit or a charitable organization? Me too. Okay, so almost everyone. As you all know, there's a huge emphasis on charity in Islam. I mean, not only is zakah one of our pillars, but there's so many hadith, and the prophetic model is about giving, and giving in so many different ways. What we found in our research is that Muslims are definitely heeding that call, answering that call, and are very charitable individuals and as a community. Through our consumer spending analysis, we found that the average Michigan Muslim household spent 18% more of their income on charity in 2015 than the average household nationally. So Muslims are spending 18% more on charity than their American counterparts. Through our interviews with Muslim-run nonprofits and social service organizations, we found that in 2015 alone, in just one state, in just 1 year, Muslims donated at least $177 million in charity, 1.3 million pounds of food, over 45,000 articles of clothing, over 14,000 gallons of water, over 6,000 backpacks, and they rehabbed over 150 homes. And I say at least because this was just what was recorded through Muslim-run organizations, and it doesn't include donations that were given through other outlets or that may have been done anonymously. We also found that a lot of Muslim-run organizations don't accurately record the donations they receive and dole out. So we spent a lot of time working with these organizations to get their baseline figures. So this is definitely an underestimate, but again, in just 1 year for one state, it's a considerable impact that they're making. Michigan is also home to many Muslim-run social service organizations, including Zaman International. Zaman International was founded by a woman named Najah Bazi, who's a registered nurse, and she founded the organization in 1999. Zaman provides basic services to thousands of families in need, having collected more than 60,000 donations of food, clothing, and furniture in the last 5 years alone. In addition, the organization provides unique services, like one of their newest, starting in 2005, called Plots for Tots. And basically, it's a burial service for those who need to bury their children who don't have the needs to do so. And we point this out because it's a service that people don't even really think, or a need that people don't even really think of. And this organization was able to not just provide direct need services, but think about other niche services that the community might need and fulfill it. Another example of work that's going above and beyond is the Maid Institute in Flint, Michigan. The Maid Institute was founded by a man named Leon El-Alamin, and it's a nonprofit that provides reintegration services for prisoners who have served their sentence and are coming back into the community. It was established by Leon, who himself was formerly incarcerated, and his organization not only mentors and provides job training to those, again, coming out of the prison system, but they were behind a campaign in Genesee County, where Flint is in Michigan, to ban the box. So what that means is there's a box on job applications that ask, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Like, are you previously a felon? And the research shows that if you mark that box correctly, you're less likely to be called for an interview and less likely to get a job. And unfortunately, if you come out of the prison system and you're unable to get hired and find a job, then you're more likely to enter the prison system again because you don't have means of providing for yourself or your family. So Leon and the Maid Institute was behind this campaign that actually got Genesee County to ban the box. So it's now illegal in Genesee County to ask that question of your job applicants. And this opens the door to potential jobs for previously incarcerated individuals to come back and actually reacclimate into society. Leon truly embodies the idea that we as humans should learn from our past while keeping an eye on the future. And he reflects on this by saying, so be inspired, surround yourself with positive people, and always educate yourself beyond what's being taught in classrooms. The world and life around you is just one big classroom, and you can learn so much from it. Leon's story also reminds us that Muslims are not one-dimensional. Their contributions come from a place of intersectionality, and it showcases the Muslim communities and the state's diversity. So moving to the next category we studied under economic development, Regardless of faith, racial, or political background, there's one thing that's on most people's mind, and that's the economy, or money. In 2015, just 1 year, Michigan Muslim consumer spending totaled $5.5 billion. That's billion with a B. Also in 2015, Muslims owned over 35,000 businesses in the state of Michigan alone. And these businesses employ over 100,000 people. When we were conducting our research, it was during the height of the 2016 presidential campaign, and jobs and the economy is always a big part of that rhetoric. And we were reflecting as a team at some of Trump's campaign promises, and he was making a big deal about saving jobs. And he would go to different plants and say, like, we're gonna save your job, I'm gonna save your job. And at one point, he had made a deal, a very great deal, to save 200 jobs, and he was so proud of himself, and everyone was giving him big accolades. And I'm not trying to be dismissive of those 200 people to save their job, that's fantastic. But when we were hearing that and hearing him so excited about saving these 200 jobs, we just wanted to scream from the rooftops that here is this tiny community, the Muslim community, who in the 2016 election was being vilified, and here they are quietly creating 100,000 jobs for individuals in just one state. Something that the Muslim community might not even realize themselves, and definitely was not getting any airtime. But aside from spurring economic growth and creating jobs and consumer spending, Muslims are also working to address economic inequalities, which is a huge deal in this country. You might have heard of Imam Salim Khalid because of his work with the Muslim Enrichment Project, if you're from Michigan or near that state. It's an organization that seeks to support Muslim converts. But what you likely don't know is that Imam Salim has a long history in addressing structural inequality and seeking economic justice for all. He began his career with Standard Federal Savings, which is now known as Bank of America, where he became the bank's first Muslim and African American vice president. Imam Salim's career in Detroit's banking and financial sector allowed him to recognize the long-standing discriminatory lending practices against people of color in the city of Detroit. As executive director for the Detroit Alliance of Fair Banking, a coalition of community, religious, and political organizations that was formed to monitor financial institution compliance, Imam Salim oversaw a $4.2 billion community action plan that provided Detroiters unprecedented access to credit, employment, professional, and other opportunities. Using his experience and expertise to address such inequalities, he worked with the National Bank of Detroit and other banks to make housing loans available to those in underserved communities and primarily to people of color. All right, so how many people here have heard Muslims flippantly say that most Muslims are doctors and engineers? I said that, I alluded to that earlier when we were talking about class and status in the Muslim community. But that's something that people say, like, oh, we're all doctors and engineers. Look at any masjid board, it's run by doctors and engineers, right? I'm married to an engineer, so it's not a bad thing, but there are other Muslims who do other things. When we were doing this research, we kept hearing the statistic that 10% of doctors in this country are Muslim. And we heard this from countless people from varied backgrounds. And every time we asked for the source of that statistics, we got a lot of shrugs and no data. So it was just something that people, it sounded good to them. Yeah, I think about 10% of doctors in this country are Muslim. We're gonna go with that. Like, okay, well, that's not how statistics work, so let's try to get to the bottom of this. So this was a stat that we were really curious to get our hands on and see just how many doctors are actually Muslim. So when we looked at the number and percentage of licensed medical doctors in the state of Michigan, we found that, again, Muslims in that state make up less than 3% of the total population, but they make up a whopping 15.4% of all the medical doctors. So we were shocked when we found this out. So not only was 10% wrong, but it was an underestimate. And that, again, this tiny community is actually highly overrepresented in the medical field. And to contextualize the impact that these doctors are making, in just one state again, Muslim medical doctors provide 1.6 million appointments per year. So Muslim medical professionals are providing 1.6 million appointments to patients per year, and they are indirectly supporting almost 40,000 jobs every year through the medical field. We also found that over 10.6% of all pharmacists in the state of Michigan are Muslim, and they fill over 15 million retail drug prescriptions per year. Again, you have this tiny community that's just making a massive impact at every area that we researched. But we're not just providing basic healthcare. We found that Muslim doctors are also behind innovative healthcare. One example is Dr. Mahmoud Hai of Westland, Michigan, who specializes in the treatment of prostate blockages and is a leader in developing green light laser technology. So what that is an innovative treatment option for those that are suffering from enlarged prostate glands. And normally, if you're suffering from this, you have to go through surgery that's incredibly painful and has a long recovery period. But this approach, using a green light laser, is less painful and less invasive for patients than traditional methods. So under Dr. Hai's leadership, his team actually performed the first FDA clinical trials on this technique in the country, and became the first clinic and team to start using this type of laser therapy in surgery. And to date, this innovative technique has been used on over 1 million patients in this country. And again, that was a Muslim invention. So I said that we studied people that fell under 8 categories, but many of the Muslims we interviewed didn't neatly just fall into one bucket. So we would speak to a teacher who also volunteers at a health clinic on the weekends, or we would speak to a doctor. Actually, we spoke to one doctor who had his own radio show on the weekends, and people don't just neatly fall into buckets. There's one woman, Juman Dola Al-Amari, who makes strides in the STEM field, education, economic development, and civics and democracy. Juman is truly a visionary in every field in which she is involved, rising to leadership positions in professional arenas with few other women. She not only serves as the Information Technology Audit Director at Wayne State University in Michigan, but she's also a board member on the Michigan Underground Storage Tank Authority, a position she was appointed to by Governor Rick Snyder. Now, Michigan has several industrial sites across the state, and hazardous waste is stored underground in giant tankers. And Juman monitors these tanks to make sure they are up to code and that hazardous material is not leaking out into the ground and into the groundwater and making us sick. If problems are found when she's inspecting these sites, she helps to manage a $40 million cleanup fund that is used to address those leakages. To help address gender inequalities, especially in business and entrepreneurship, Juman serves on the executive board of the Arab American Women's Business Council and leads the networking committee for the group. Juman also serves on the executive board of ISACA, a nonprofit independent association that advocates for professionals involved in information security, assurance, risk management, and governance. As vice president of the Detroit chapter of ISACA, she's part of the International Women's Task Force that works on encouraging women to pursue STEM careers, specifically within audit and cybersecurity. So I'd like to note here that actually only 24% of STEM jobs in this country are held by women. And Juman not only is a STEM professional, but a big part of her career is opening the door to make sure that other women can participate in STEM careers. And she's not the only other woman who's doing this. We spoke to a Muslim woman named Lisa Gandhi on the west side of the state of Michigan, and she is a professor of computer science. She's actually the only female professor in her College of Technology. And what she does in her spare time is run a camp in rural Michigan that encourages girls ages 11 to 13 to explore STEM careers. Just another example of Muslims, not just doing incredible work themselves, but really mentoring and encouraging future generations to get involved in various ways. But going back to Jaman, as an appointed public official, Jaman in her role is literally serving all 9.9 million Michiganders in a position that few people even knew existed. I mean, I've never heard of the Michigan Underground Storage Tank Authority before doing this project, and obviously it's an important job. I mean, again, Michigan has had its fair share of water crises. The water crisis in Flint is not over yet. And so making sure that, new crises are not forming, that this hazardous waste is not getting in our groundwater is a big deal. And it's a Muslim woman who's overseeing that. And it was a Muslim woman who was appointed by the governor to oversee this. Jaman's multiple roles and her public service position help us think beyond the limited framework of what Muslims typically do. So we're not all doctors and engineers, and it expands the way we think of political service. I mean, one of my favorite findings in doing the MAP project was actually to see how many Muslims we have involved in public service and in local politics in the state of Michigan. Again, when we were doing our field work, it was during the 2016 presidential election. So it was just such a heightened time in the community, and it really lit a fire under the community, right? I mean, you saw this synergy across so many different Muslim organizations, encouraging people to get registered to vote, encouraging people to get out the vote, but you also saw this synergy in terms of Muslims deciding to stand up and get politically involved, running for office themselves. And you saw that, and you continue to see that, and that's fantastic. But what we found was that we actually have a number of Muslims in Michigan already involved in public office. In the last 5 years alone, we found 35 Muslims who serve as elected or appointed public officials, and we also have a lot of national firsts in the state of Michigan. So we're home to the country's first Muslim judge, Honorable Adam Shakur, who was appointed in 1981. We're home to the country's first Muslim mayor, Al Haydous of Wayne, Michigan, and he's actually one of 2 Muslim mayors of the state. And depending on how the campaign goes this year, we might be home to the first Muslim governor if Abdullah Sayed wins his campaign. After Donald Trump won the election in 2016, which is insane to think that was only a year ago, a dear friend of mine got a text from a concerned parent of school who saw her 8-year-old son quietly crying in the corner. This boy is one of the most brilliant kids I've ever met. He is an old soul in a young body and really wise beyond his years. And he was crying at school because after Trump won, he thought that that would mean that he could never become president as a Muslim kid in this country. And that was a dream that he was privately holding on to. The constant barrage of negative information of Muslims doesn't just affect those outside of the community. We opened up this talk today talking about how the media is overwhelmingly negative. And so for those who have never met a Muslim, they're only introduced to Islam and Muslims through this negative media. Well, we are also absorbing this media, and we're also absorbing these negative messages, and especially our children are absorbing it, not just in the media, but also in their schools. And so the MAP project tells part of the American Muslim story, our story, through data. And this is a story that Muslims need to hear and know and understand just as much as our fellow Americans. I encourage you all to visit our website, muslimsforamericanprogress.org, where you can read through the rest of our findings, learn about the many incredible Muslims who are quietly improving the well-being of all of our lives, and also share what you've learned. And you can do this by citing our data in letters to the editor. So if you've seen a really bad news story, you can write to the editor. You can share your opinion and actually back that opinion up with data. You can use our data and examples in discussions with public officials at city council meetings or town halls. I'm really excited to say that our data has already been shared in front of both local and national government bodies. At the beginning of the year, we held a congressional briefing where our executive director of ISPU shared our findings, both our poll findings and our MAP findings, directly with members of Congress. Congressman Andre Carson, who is one of 2 Muslim congressmen we have in this country, he held a special order hour in Congress where he literally got the floor for an hour and got to share stats and stories of the Muslim community in front of Congress, and he turned to ISPU and the MAP project to share our data and our story directly, again, with members of Congress. But you can also share our stories in classroom presentations and community discussions. We've had this presentation in the basement of churches, in community centers, at universities, and all of the information that we put out as an organization, we upload online in really accessible formats, and we ask people to use it and share it. So if you're part of PTO, if your kids are in a school, if they task you for that Islam 101 talk, you can use some of our demographic data and data on contributions to go beyond just what we believe, but our lived experiences and how we're contributing. Looking forward to next year, we're actually working on a recorded presentation along with a PowerPoint and discussion guide that will be available for public use. So that's something you can download and share in schools and community settings. We're also touring the country and doing community presentations, and we have a photo exhibit. I mentioned the portraits that we did that we're sharing across the country as well. But we hope the MAP project helps to achieve the goal of an educated citizenry and help remind Muslims that we are not the evil villains that we see on TV. We are an integral and important part of this country. Thank you.